Hi everyone, I'm Ruben and I'm delighted to welcome you to Think Global, the mini-series. Now, as we've all experienced, COVID-19 has disrupted the global economy, consumer behaviours and businesses around the world. Yet at the same time, activities such as online shopping have doubled and many businesses have found the pace of their digital adoption has accelerated by up to 5 years. Now, as an example, cross-border purchasing, which was always 50% of e-commerce even before COVID-19, has grown by 21%. This has prompted those businesses that spotted the international opportunity to use their new digital reach to diversify away from their local dependencies, capture this new demand and gain a real advantage over their competitors. And really that's the aim of Think Global, to understand how they did it so we can do it ourselves. What made them so effective? What insights informed their global approach? So for this first episode, I'm eager to understand the global economic context so we can have a clearer idea of where the international opportunity lies, with whom, and to a certain extent when we ought to be thinking about starting our international growth. Now, I can think of no one more qualified to help us do exactly that than Zanny Minton-Beddoes, the editor-in-chief of The Economist. Now, Zanny's the first woman to have held the post and is one of the most influential voices in international journalism. So I was delighted that she found some time to sit down with me and share some of her expert insight. Let's have a look at that conversation. So hi Zanny, thank you so much for joining us in this. At the end of last year, you wrote that a once-in-a-century pandemic created an opportunity for an economic and a social reset. I wonder what you think that economic reset now looks like.
Hi Ruben, it's very nice to join you. Thank you for having me. Well, I think there are, let's say, at least 3 elements to the economic reset, and I hope 4. And the 3 that I'm pretty sure about, the first is we are going to see, or we are already seeing, what we've called a tech-acceleration. And we're seeing it all around us, years of technological progress basically crammed into months. The way we work, the way we live, the way we shop, it's all been transformed, radically accelerated. That's kind of step 1. The second step of the economic reset is that I think globalization, which was really the leitmotif, if you will, of the last few decades, has been quite radically reshaped. Not only is there much greater focus on resilience in supply chains, on having critical imports, critical things made at home, there's also, I think, a sense that business travel isn't going to go back to where it was. I don't suspect it'll be the end of travel altogether, but I do think there's been a reshaping there. The third big element of the economic reset is a radical change in people's expectations of the role of the state. For the last year, we've all been in kind of virtual house arrest and lockdowns in many parts of the world, and many people's livelihoods have been sustained by support from the state in various ways, whether it's unemployment insurance, whether it's furlough schemes. I think we have, as a result, changed what we expect from the state. And we're going to see, I hope, a rethinking of what the social safety net should look like in the 21st century. And the fourth element of the reset, which I'm not 100% sure of yet, but I hope happens, is that we realize, thanks to the shock and horror, frankly, of the pandemic, which is when a kind of low probability event happens and affects the whole world, that we think more seriously about combating the inevitable and high impact thing that we know stands ahead of us, which is climate change. So I hope we think more seriously about how to combat climate change. And if we have all of those 4 elements of the reset, we may end up, as you say, quoting me, getting opportunity from crisis.
I love that. And I love your honesty in saying, look, you know, I can't 100% predict this, because I think that's true of everyone. As you alluded to, the title of that piece was After a Crisis, Opportunity. How would you sum up the opportunity as it stands?
Well, there's opportunities in all of the areas that I talked about. Take, for example, the tech acceleration, which I think is really one of the areas that we all sense and see and live really powerfully. think of the opportunities we have seen coming from science in the past year. Huge medical breakthroughs, huge opportunities to digitize medicine, huge opportunities to harness the power of digital technology, the power of big data, the power of artificial intelligence in all in all areas. And so I think that's the one where I point to and say, it's just a huge set of opportunities. When anytime you have progress that we expected to take years, really done in a matter of months, then you have a huge amount of opportunity, commercial opportunity for social change that comes as a result of that. So that's where I'd point to. We've accelerated the digital revolution. Let's make the most of the opportunities that brings.
Brilliant. I love that. Inspiring stuff, Zanny. So look, as you said, there is huge opportunity, and we could obviously talk for hours about it. Let's, however, try and focus our conversation a little bit and maybe structure it around three dimensions that are particularly critical when it comes to international growth. So where we're going to expand to, who is going to drive the expansion in those markets, and first of all, when. I wonder, with your global perspective, what do you see as factors in the short term anyway that we should be looking out for in order to help influence that decision in terms of when to take our first step internationally?
So I think in the short term, the two big factors that are going to influence how quickly economies bounce back are, firstly, how quickly do they get the pandemic under control and indeed ideally put it behind them? And secondly, how much pent-up consumer demand is there and how much government fiscal and monetary support? And I think you can divide the world into, sort of on both those paradigms. So if, for example, you look at the United States, it is likely to put the pandemic behind it reasonably quickly. Vaccine rates are rising fast. It's also got an enormous fiscal support. Almost 30% of GDP in total is the amount of fiscal support that's come from the United States. The result is there's an awful lot of pent-up consumer spending, and I think you're going to see really very, very high US growth rates this year, 2021. At another extreme, you have Europe, which has made much less progress on putting the pandemic behind it. Unfortunately, much so far, lower rates of vaccination, rising cases, and less fiscal and monetary support. So I think by looking through those two prisms, you can kind of put countries into one of four quadrants, which gives you a sense where in the short term, how fast the recovery is going to be.
Thank you, Zanny. I love the idea of looking at it through the prism of four quadrants, as you said. What about longer term? What trends do you see shaping global economic growth in, let's say, the next 5 or 10 years?
I think in the medium to longer term, the sort of fundamentals that have always driven growth are going to reassert themselves. That is, population growth, particularly growth of the working age population, its productivity, the economic dynamism that a country has, it's its macroeconomic policy environment. These are, boring sounding fundamentals, but those fundamentals are what matter. And if you look along those fundamentals, you have huge opportunity in emerging Asia. It's the most dynamic part of the world. You have huge opportunity in sub-Saharan Africa. It's where the working age population is going to be growing the fastest over the coming decades. You also, I think, have opportunity amongst advanced economies, particularly in the US, which has a younger, more dynamic population, certainly than Europe does. But I wouldn't count out Europe. Europe is older. In Europe's case, it depends dramatically on policy. There's a huge amount of potential from really creating a single digital market, from really pushing policy reforms that the Europeans haven't yet done. And I think if you embrace that, you could even see very dynamic growth there. So it depends in some on the underlying fundamentals, how big your market is, how fast your population's growing. It depends on whether you embrace technological change, how much fast your productivity grows, and what your overall economic environment is like.
Yes, to your point, the fundamentals remain in place, even though we've just been through a huge period of change. Just to finish off the when, the timing piece, I'm interested in a very specific part of timing when it comes to planning an international growth strategy, and those are those moments, those seasonal moments, things like Easter, like Black Friday, etc., that trigger a spike in sales and can also act as a driver for international growth. Over the last year, all of that has shifted to wholly being a digital experience. In the future, do you see the fact that that is now a wholly digital experience, do you see that creating new seasonal opportunities, or do you think it's just going to be a case of those seasonal opportunities that we already have just developing in a slightly different way?
So the honest answer is I have no idea. You're much better qualified to answer this than I am. You're the marketing experts. I'm not. But I'll give you one thought from the outside, which is, you're right, we've seen huge amounts of innovation in the past year. And what struck me is the speed with which new memes, new digital experiences, new events, with which they go viral, with which they spread globally. So that combination of speed and scale means that I think there'll be all manner of things that we haven't even thought of yet. They're going to be driving those marketing moments going forward. So I don't think it's going to be static. It's unbelievably innovative. And so good ideas will spread incredibly quickly and will spread to a global audience. So it's the goal, I guess, is to make sure you're the people who have those good ideas.
I love that inspirational call to action in terms of our own innovations, Annie. Thank you for that. As I said, you have given us a really good overview of how the different markets, different areas of the world are going to perform post-pandemic, and I wondered if we could just deep dive a little bit into the dimension of where, and ask you if there are any particular markets, any particular regions that you think are going to recover quicker, bounce back more speedily than others in a post-pandemic world.
Well, let me give you two examples, which are, I guess, based on my little quadrant analysis. And the first is the United States, because I think the United States is going to undergo this year really a macroeconomic experiment unprecedented in decades. It's almost hard to fathom quite how much money is being pumped into the US economy by the US government. That means that consumers are going to have a huge amount of money to spend, and they've been building up savings during COVID, which they've also now got ready to spend. So I think there'll be very high growth rates in the US, and it will be really interesting to see where that spending goes, particularly since the stimulus package is very much focused on less well-off Americans. So you could see all manner of changes in consumer spending there. So that would be what I'd really, really look at. And then the other one is emerging Asia, particularly China, where China didn't, it was the only big economy to grow in 2020. So it's not like it's bouncing back because it got COVID under control very fast, but it is a very, very fast growing dynamic economy, which in many ways is the place where the trends of the future are currently being incubated. So I think seeing what happens there, seeing what happens to consumer spending, seeing where that goes is another big area to focus on.
Fascinating stuff. So to keep our eyes on certainly how consumers are behaving in both the US and China. You touched upon this idea of kind of emerging trends in those two markets, and actually that's something else I'd like to ask you about. Pre-pandemic, there was an emerging trend towards urbanization of the growth of so-called mega cities, and how they in themselves drove certain economies, drove growth in certain markets. What's your feeling about the role of megacities and urbanisation more generally post-COVID in a post-pandemic world? Should we still be thinking in terms of that kind of hyper-localisation of campaigns?
So I think megacities are going to play as big a role going forward as they did before the pandemic. I know it's become very fashionable to talk about the fact that people are no longer going to want to live in cities, that there's in an era of distributed working, everyone wants to go and, have more space and live in the country, raise chickens or whatever. That may be true of certain people, but I have a suspicion, particularly younger people, are going to want to congregate. They're going to want to be near other young people. And so I think it's way too early to write off the global city, the global megalopolis, if you will. I think these cities will need to reinvent themselves. We're going to see a different kind of real estate. We'll probably see fewer huge office blocks, more residential space. But that's the exciting bit, is what does consumption patterns, what does the kind of behavior of people in cities look like over the next few years? But I certainly wouldn't count out the cities. And if you look more broadly across the emerging world, urbanization is still going to be the big route to development. So the world's big cities are going to carry on getting bigger, I'm pretty sure.
Yes, it's that's a very good point. Well made. I wonder, Zanny, what's your take on retiring to the country and chickens? Are you a city dweller or a fan of the country?
Well, I don't really fall into the demographic of young anymore, so I can justifiably want to spend a bit of time in the country. But to be honest, even I grew up on a farm. I'm a rural girl at heart. I can't imagine spending 100% of my time in the country. I would be bored senseless. So I would like to spend some time in the country, but I absolutely want to be in the city. I mean, the kind of excitement, the idea generation, the thrill of urban life is still as exciting to me as it ever was, and I'm way on the edge of the old side now. So people younger than me, that's got to be true in spades.
Thank you for that level of honesty, Zanny. But actually, the point you make is a really interesting one. So, that the cities and urbanisation skews towards a slightly younger audience, and yet there'll be many businesses and brands listening to this whose ordinary target audience skews slightly older. And I'd be interested in your thoughts in terms of where audiences are going to have the most appetite for products and services post-pandemic. Are there any particular sectors that are going to boast audiences that have that appetite post-pandemic? Are there going to be particular sectors that are going to thrive, do you think?
Let me give you two thoughts. One, I think you're absolutely right about the focus on older consumers. And one of the things that's really struck me in the past year has been the speed with which more older consumers have gone digital, and the shift, and I think there are numbers to back this up, the sort of share of people making their first purchase in their 60s and 70s on various digital platforms has shot up. And so we now have a new kind of consumer, the very digitally savvy older consumer. And as you say, older consumers have a lot of the wealth and spending power. So I think that's a really interesting one. And the other big question, I think, is whether and to what degree the focus on sustainability that we are seeing is real and lasting and likely to be prevalent across segments. And my sense is it is real. My sense is that this is a shift that is here to stay and is one that is going to kind of define people's consumption patterns ever more. And so I think for a long time it was perhaps viewed as a bit of a sort of flash in the pan consumer focus, but actually I think this is now real and lasting. And so I'd sort of add that one too.
No, I love that. And again, it's actually absolutely fascinating, I think, for everyone to hear your perspective, because you're looking at this from a very much more of a global economic perspective than a purely a marketing one. So actually that fresh perspective is really valuable for all of us when we're planning our international growth strategies. You actually talked a little bit there about some of the broader trends that should influence our thinking in terms of which audiences we're targeting, the aging population, the importance of sustainability. Do you see any other trends that we should perhaps keep our eyes on in terms of audiences, in terms of the demographics, shall we say, that will help with our international growth strategy, perhaps in the medium to long term, Zanny?
So the one other striking development, I think, has been the role of the Chinese consumer. Now, everyone knows that the Chinese consumer is a rapidly growing market. It's a market that every company in the world wants to get a piece of. But what has really struck me, certainly from my colleagues' reporting over the past few months, has been the degree to which Chinese consumption habits, but also the Chinese way of living and shopping is showing us where the future of whether it's retail, is going. So, for example, for most of the 20th century, or late 20th century, you would look to the US for trends in retail, whether it was big box warehouses or whatever. It was the US that led the way. And in important ways now, I think the future of shopping is being defined by what is happening in China. Innovations in both the nature of, the digital payment system, but innovations in the way that products are marketed, products are shown to customers. There's a lot of really interesting innovation happening in China now. It's happening within the Chinese ecosystem, so it's not so easy to see from outside. But I think that's the place to go to see a lot of the trends of how people are going to consume and shop in the future.
Fascinating stuff. Thank you, Zanny. And actually, it brings me quite nicely on to the final question of today. So you've given us a brilliant overview of the where, of the when, and of the who when it comes to starting to think about our international expansion. And I wonder if you could have a little bit of a think about how you'd sum up this whole conversation. I started by saying that the title of your piece at the end of last year was After a Crisis Opportunity. How would you sum up this conversation? What's your headline to take away from this?
Well, let me give you two. The first, I think, is if you're looking for ideas, it's look east. Look east for the ideas. And if you want a kind of summary of where we've come from and where we're going to, it is from globalization to tech-acceleration. Those are the big trends of the post-COVID world.
Wow. Zanny genuinely didn't disappoint when it came to real international global insight. Now, hopefully with that insight, plus access to tools like Google Market Finder, we've all been inspired to focus and prioritise on where exactly our international opportunities lie. Now, the next episode is how we tap into that potential, how we as challenger brands can seek to enter new markets and start to take market share from more established businesses. Join me for the next episode.